Greetings, one and all. Welcome to this conversation with Paul Buhl. My name is Tyler Friedman. I'm the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at the Museum of Wisconsin Art, and I'm one of the co-curators along with Dennis Kitchen and Jim Danke for Wisconsin Funny's 50 Years of Comics, which is up at MOWA West Bend and MOWA DTN now through November 22nd. Delighted to be here talking with Paul. I'd like to give special thanks to the Wisconsin Humanities Council for supporting this talk, as well as dedicated exhibition sponsors, the National Endowment for the Arts and the Wisconsin Department of Tourism. So hello, Paul, welcome here. Thanks for joining us. Paul, you are a retired senior lecturer at Brown University, as well as the author and editor of about 35 volumes of diverse sorts: history, popular culture, comics, graphic novels, and we're going to get into all of that. But I thought we would begin at the beginning and was hoping that you would start off by talking a little bit about your early years, where you grew up, what that was like.
I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, which is on the one hand, central Illinois, very waspy, very rural, nevertheless a college town, a large college town, and plenty of access to Bohemian and other strange sorts of books, paperbacks, blues records, and all the sorts of things that wouldn't be available in Farmer City, 30 miles away. But I had a normal comics childhood of someone born in 1944, which is to say, comics were in their big boom years, and many titles sold 500,000 every issue that appeared. Along with paperback books, which were really new to the market, there were shelves in drugstores and specialized newspaper stores that had vast space for comic books and a vast number of young people who tried hard to read 10 or 20 comics without buying a single one. I was one of those kids. So I was fascinated with comic art, perhaps most so because the late 1940s were the heyday of the funny animal comics. Not only Donald Duck and those several others that were very popular, but an array of utterly obscure funny animals that existed only because the market was so enormous at that time. But in later years, I would look back upon the fantastic character of those comics, and they helped me to come to the conclusion by the time I was 9 or 10 that superhero comics, by and large, were a dull bunch. The world of superheroes, which seems still to occupy 98% of comic sales, really was not for me. Aquaman aside, he saved animals in the ocean and the animals helped him to deal with the evildoers. I like that a lot. But so I'm maybe 10, it's 1954, 1955, and I come across a copy of the very last issues of Mad Comics, before Mad was forced to go the route of magazines to escape censorship, which was coming onto the comic scene at that time, and turned from a 24-page color comic, pulp comic, into a slick 40-page magazine. Now, the reality is that the magazine was much tamer in satirical shafts at American culture, American business, American politics than Mad Comics had been. And I could realize that because between 1955 and 1960, and really a decade later, those Mad Comics were sliced up and put into 35-cent paperback books. 5 of them that appeared, and these were the cream of the cream. And everyone like me who sought this kind of quasi-culturally subversive culture and enjoyed the sheer art of these comics, the satirists, found in these 5 paperback books everything we needed to know about American society, more or less. It gave us a way to understand the world of consumerism and mass sales and McCarthyism and all these other things that were right in front of our eyes, but adults didn't seem to see them as clearly as those mad comics artists. So that's very big. And along with my baseball hero, Willie Mays, along with the stand-up comic, Lenny Bruce, and my great political hero, Martin Luther King Jr., these are the things that gave me a guidance into my teenage years and beyond, and have remained with me ever since.
Years later, you were able to get into contact with Harvey Kurtzman, the brilliant creator of Mad Comics and Mad Magazine. That's right.
Yes, and then still later, Dennis Kitchen and I did a biography, the first biography to appear, of Harvey Kurtzman. So he plays a fairly central role in Dennis Kitchen's life and mine. But it so happened that I was publishing a magazine in Madison, a sort of history magazine of sorts called Radical America, the search for some kind of America that wasn't the America that supported the war in Vietnam, but was more quirky and odd and bohemian and all those sorts of things. And I had the great opportunity to ask Gilbert Sheldon, who was the single most popular comic artist in underground newspapers. He had invented characters, the fabulous furry freak brothers, and they circulated through these newspapers, and then it began only in 1968 to be reprinted in little books. Well, I received one of those little books. It may have been sent by Gilbert himself from Austin, and decided that I would publish an issue of my magazine, Radical America, as a comic book, a standalone comic book. It appeared in February 1969, and many subscribers were pretty shocked or nonplussed to receive a comic book in their subscriptions rather than a studious, serious take on American history and American culture. And on the other hand, I think that the FBI had been pretty indifferent until that issue of Radical America appeared, Radical America Comics. And when it appeared, it combined the criticism of war with an advocacy of smoking marijuana. And this put us on the FBI radar, where we stayed for some years. So it also was the best-selling issue of any magazine I ever published. So it was a success. And Dennis Kitchen sent that copy of Radical America Comics to Harvey Kurtzman, who was by that time years past several failures after Mad Comics and Mad Magazine. He'd unwisely abandoned the ship, wanting to have complete creative control, which he couldn't have of the new Mad Magazine, but failed in magazine after magazine. And he was always interested in new things in comics, fascinated with new things in comics. So I sent this to him with a note, and he responded very kindly. And we got in touch, exchanged a few notes, and then years go past. I'm directing an oral history program at New York University. And I had him come and do an interview and asked him a lot of questions about his family life, his background, and his art, as I did of other people I interviewed, and felt that I had a series of insights into Harvey Kurtzman's life, and that's meant a lot to me ever since.
Interesting, very interesting. So what would you say it was about Mad Magazine and Kurtzman in particular that was so life-changing and career-orienting, not just for you, but for a lot of the early underground cartoonists?
Indeed, and not only for them. Harvey Kurtzman innovated, almost created a critique of society through the critique of form. That is to say, in Mad Comics, we came to understand why television advertising was ridiculous, not only because of the message, but because of the cliched form in which that message took place. It was an extremely sophisticated way to look at modern culture. And one of the creators of Monty Python lived with Kurtzman for a while and swore later that Monty Python was largely based on the form of humor that Harvey Kurtzman had invented. Others would say, he would say, that Saturday Night Live, much of the spirit of its adventurous satire came from Harvey Kurtzman and that critique of form. And other people would say that other kinds of humor that have been created ever since owe a lot to Kurtzman's critique. Now I'm just an 11-year-old kid. I had no reason to understand what the heck this stuff was all about and what it meant to critique the form of culture. And yet it sunk into me, and it sunk into others at the same time. Now there's another link to this, and that is that comics were severely censored in 1954. I wrote an illustrated book called Comics in Wisconsin about 10 years ago, published by a regional press in Madison. It's sort of like a precursor to the catalog, you might say. And came to understand that in Wisconsin, there were hearings on whether comic books should be banned. And in one community not far from Milwaukee, they had a mass comic book burning. It didn't happen anyplace else. A civil libertarian leader in the state Senate prevented a law from being passed to ban comic books, which would have been impossible in any case. So that moment went by. But the feeling was among artists my age, real artists, not me, an observer and a commentator and a critic, that if there was going to be something new in comics, it would be entirely uncensored. There was also a feeling that the artists who made almost no money would own their own work, the rights to their own work. Both of these were entirely contrary to the history of comic art and comics in newspapers until then. There are a few exceptions, but basically, when you drew something, it belonged to the people who bought it. You had no more capacity to deal with it. And like television until 1970, perhaps, they were rigidly censored for sex, for violence, and for political statements, except the conservative political statements that appeared in war comics. So by and large, this was a world that was tightly contained. For the underground comics artists, of whom Dennis Kitchen was one, the point was to burst all that open and to be able for the artists to have the creative expression that artists in the world of high art had, to be able to say any darn thing they wanted, but also something the high artists didn't have, to be able to express it in pulp comic pages and have it available to its most ready consumers, that is to say, the rebellious teenagers and people in their 20s of the late 1960s to the 1970s. So it was a new art, a dramatically different art in the entire history of comics, created by and for people in their 20s. Really a phenomenal development. Underground newspapers were another phenomenal development and innovative in the same way. But comics presented something to the history of comic art which was entirely unexpected. And even though that particular part of the history is faded into other things we could discuss, the importance of that as a historic development in comic art remains extremely central to any sensibility of what comic art has done and how it's evolved.
Two intellectual preoccupations seem to pervade your life and CV, and those are popular culture on the one hand and the political left. You've written 4 books on the Hollywood blacklist and have undertaken a lot of different projects about the intersection of comics and politics. Would you say that it was Mad Magazine and its critique of form, as you put it, when you first became aware that comics can be or are already political?
Yeah, I must insist on Mad Comics and not Mad Magazine.
Excuse me.
Mad Magazine was severely, in many ways, it offers a liberal message, and that's to be applauded. But from the moment Harvey Kurtzman left, they were seeking a younger audience, a less sophisticated audience. It's hard to think of that in comic terms, and weakening the message so it wouldn't be so sharp and severe, and making it more available to 11-year-olds and to a wider public. So I would say I trace it back to Mad Comics. But, in 1955, 1957, 1958, the civil rights movement is emerging in the South and in the North. And it wasn't too difficult for me to put these things together. Now, I want to stress that my take on the left has always been the American left. Others are more interested in what was happening in Moscow or Beijing and elsewhere. Not me. My special interest had been the populists, the grassroots socialists, Gene Debs, who grew up in Terre Haute, just an hour's drive from my home in Champaign, and others, Robert La Follette, very high among those people, who represented forms of resistance to the power, the rich and powerful, but found a way, it hasn't always succeeded, but found a way to express those ideas to ordinary Americans. And I suppose Bernie Sanders is the most recent example. And I helped to produce part of a comic about Bernie Sanders during the last couple of years. So that's a natural consequence of the joining of my different interests.
You already touched on Radical America comics a little bit, but it seems to me that that's the earliest marriage of these two passions. In 1969, and Radical America was the unofficial organ for the Students for a Democratic Society, and is credited with being, in someone else's quote, on the scholarly cutting edge of a movement lacking intellectual substance. So going back to this prejudice about what comics were and could be back in the day, why publish the journal as a comic book, a medium which especially at the time was regarded as adolescent and unintellectual?
Yeah, well, there were two different kinds of radicals on the campus in those days. And there were people who wished they lived in some other country, more frequently France than Russia, most certainly. But someplace really civilized, like Europe, for instance. And they constituted the center of much of the graduate student community. And we had very, very great teachers, of whom the greatest was George Mossy and William Appleman Williams, major figures in American history and European history to teach us. We were very fortunate in those years. But then there were the mass of ordinary students who really hadn't thought too much about all the issues of politics of the day until, first of all, they were getting drafted, or if they were co-eds, their boyfriends or their brothers, and sometimes their fathers were being drafted. And also, they began to live in a different way than their parents. They expected to have sex before marriage, live with someone who's thought of previously as something unimaginable, and become interested in new forms of culture that hadn't been accessible, often through this mundane underground newspapers and comics. So my idea was to reach beyond the narrow stratum of the cerebral left and to reach those ordinary undergraduates who got an impulse suddenly to see themselves as being part of an opposition in some way to the drift of society more and more towards the military-industrial complex, towards, even by 1970, the ecological crisis, which was coming very fast even then and destroying some of the beautiful places they'd grown up in and otherwise portending great dangers ahead. They began to see that by that time and to think about it. And some very important Wisconsin leaders like Gaylord Nelson were thinking about it as well. And likewise, the student leader and future mayor of Madison, Paul Soglin, a friend of mine who didn't duck when a policeman's club came his way, whereas I managed to duck. But that was a good photo. And he was mayor from 1970 to 73, most of the years, until a couple of years ago.
Let me pause there for just a second to break the fourth wall and to encourage anyone out there who is listening to submit comments or questions. Paul and I will talk for about 20 more minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a queue of questions that we can spend the final 20 minutes on.
Good.
Jumping forward a little bit, Paul, you came across Harvey Pekar in the 1990s and teamed up with him on 5 book projects. For those out there who aren't familiar with Harvey, Who was he? What was his position in comics history?
He was described as, after his death, as someone who taught people around the world to read comics in a new way. And I think that's literally true. He almost saved Robert Crumb's life. Crumb was someone from a terrible home who landed in Cleveland in 1963. And Harvey Pekar, working at the VA hospital, as he did until 2003, more or less took him in, helped him in any number of ways. And within 10 years, Harvey was scripting a comic about daily life in blue-collar Cleveland, which Crumb and a dozen other artists over the years would draw for him from his script and kind of illustrate what Harvey's own daily life was in Cleveland. You wouldn't think it was too political, but it was seen in a very political way. You wouldn't think it was cultural. It was seen in a very cultural way. And in 2002, American Splendor, the film, appeared. It's the first film that ever had both the character the life was based on, the film was based on, the animation of that character, and of course the actor playing Harvey Pekar. This is the first in Hollywood history. And it won some awards. And it sort of established Harvey Pekar as a spokesman for a different America. I mean, he'd appeared on late night television in the 1990s and so tried to explain his view, but instead he sort of represented a ridiculed Cleveland, despite his efforts to the contrary. But in the film and in the comics, he offered a clear view of what blue-collar life was like, which is very, very effective. So by the time I found him, or shortly thereafter, he had exhausted large parts of the Harvey Pekar story, and he was ready to go onward. You might note also, or comics fans will note, that Art Spiegelman exhausted the Art Spiegelman story by 2000, and Robert Crumb exhausted the Robert Crumb story by the year 2000. So there's a sense in which a phase of comic art, the new comic art, had reached its crest, and now it was time to go on and do something else. Crumb became a sort of elaborator and illustrator of great works of literature, including Genesis. And Art Spiegelman became a major figure in 100 ways, but mainly not drawing. But Harvey and I set out on a path to understand what we could find in American popular culture, in American history, American social history, that would have meaning to the new generations. And one of the books that I did with him that I'm proudest of is called Studs Terkel's Working. Now, Studs Terkel was the greatest of all figures in the field of oral history, an icon in Chicago life for more than a half a century. And Working is the book that was based upon his interviews with people and their daily lives working, mainly, but by no means only, in the Chicago area. So in his way, Harvey Pekar was Studs Terkel. You might say Studs Terkel was Harvey Pekar, but bringing these figures together, as I was able to do in this comic with a dozen artists, was a grand thing to do, a very good thing to do. But I want to say also that Harvey and I worked together with others on the first comic that I published. I edited, and sort of my idea I created, and that's called Wobblies, 2005, and it's the history of an organization that was based in Chicago, starting in 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World. So 2005 was the centenary of the Industrial Workers of the World, the most egalitarian, wild, spirited, musical, adventurous part of the labor movement that ever existed, entirely unlike the dull, driven mainstream union leadership that we're so bitterly familiar with. So this was a way of starting this out. Harvey and I then edited a comic about the Students for Democratic Society, which was very natural for me. Then we edited a comic on the Beats, the Beat Generation, which was very popular, especially in City Lights Bookstore, San Francisco, a sort of origin place of the Beats. And we did several other things together and ended with a book called Yiddishkeit, the culture of Yiddish language Jews, mainly in the United States, which has its own unique and remarkable history. And he participated in, not hugely, but participated in the last, really the last thing we did together, which was FDR and the New Deal, a way to understand the importance of the New Deal for life today. And I suspect when we look at the political situation now, the significance of the New Deal and the significance of Franklin D. Roosevelt is larger, is seen to be larger than it has been for a long time.
Let's continue talking about a few of your other projects. You mentioned the Beats project. You've also done a project on Bohemians, a graphic history.
That's right. This was, in a certain sense, the prequel to the Beats, because deep in American culture, going back to the 1840s and 1850s, people were trying very hard to live in a different way. Some of it had to do with an open sexuality, a different sexuality, but as much had to do with a belief in a cooperative society of some kind, creating cooperative structures outside the mainstream, connections with jazz and blues from the early 20th century on, and very much so the rise of modern dance, so that we get to important figures in poetry like Langston Hughes, literature like Langston Hughes, and in dance, a dozen crucial dancers coming out of the African American tradition, too little remembered today. And we pass on to Thelonious Monk and the rise of modern jazz. So this was a popular way to present this notion of there being a tradition in the US that needs looking at again, is part of our life. And even though bohemian areas of cities constantly become overpriced and the bohemians have to go somewhere else, it never quite disappears and can never disappear. So I'm quite happy with that comic.
Right. A People's History of American Empire, which was a collaborative project with Howard Zinn and Mike Konopacki.
That's right, a very Wisconsin project. Howard Zinn's People's History of the U.S. has sold several million copies. Howard Zinn was always very popular when he appeared in Wisconsin, as well as other places until his passing. And I enlisted two very important Wisconsin people. One of them was Mike Konopacki, who to this day draws comics for the Press Connection online, but was a key labor cartoonist for 40 years. And a guy named Dave Wagner, who was an important newspaper man in Madison, who led the strike of 1977 to 79 against the ownership, which had locked out the typesetters, and then led the creation of the Press Connection, which was the daily alternative newspaper that appeared for 27 months until Paul Soglin's would-be successor lost an election, a well-known Milwaukee newspaper later, Jim Rowan, and the Press Connection folded. So this was a combined work of several people who were deeply part of Wisconsin, and it's been very successful. It's the most successful comic I've done. And it's a popular way of expressing Howard Zinn's ideas, but also his life as a life in resistance, but a form of resistance very deeply in the American brain. So people like this, or you might say people hate it. I don't think the followers of Donald Trump would like it very much. But each generation seems to find something new in it. And I think it's the great value of the script writing of Dave Wagner and the marvelous drawing of Mike Konopacki. It was a good thing.
You mentioned before your book Comics in Wisconsin completed about a decade ago. And so let's turn to that theme, because of course, the connection between Wisconsin and comics is the reason that we're here. So why would you say the Dairy State has been such fertile ground for the creation, publication, and distribution of comic art?
Well, I in this book published by Borderland Books in Madison, I come to the first really key figures, Sylvester Smith, and much more important, whoa, what am I looking at here? Of course, I'm looking at Franco King. Wisconsin is close enough to the big time, big Chicago, for aspiring artists, talented young artists, to get themselves to Milwaukee, to maybe Detroit, where they can go to art school, but most important, to get themselves to the Chicago Tribune, which has the best comics section anywhere in the US, circa 1910, is deeply beloved. And these two artists create comic characters that did not exist before. Up until 1920, almost all comics were daily joke things, which had a few panels and ended with a joke in the last panel. These two guys introduced characters that were continuing. They not much seemed to change day to day, but subtly and slowly things changed, and they sort of made sense of American popular life. I have to say, largely middle class life, but they made sense of American popular life to so many readers that these characters that they created gained a life of their own. People say now that Gasoline Alley taught Americans how to read comics in a modern way, and I think that probably is true. But Barney Gump, there's a Barney Gump statue in downtown Lake Geneva on Wrigley Drive. It's a very nice statue. I wish more people who saw it understood who the character was depicted. But the Chicago Tribune became known as the Gump paper, because people would buy the Chicago Tribune daily to read that strip about Andy Gump. So already a couple of people in Wisconsin have made this dent in the mind of ordinary Americans of what comics are, why they're exciting, why they're interesting, and why you would be interested not just to see them now and then, but why you wish to follow them on a daily basis.
The essay that you wrote for the catalog for Wisconsin Fundies is in many ways a distillation of comics in Wisconsin. You also made a curatorial contribution to the exhibition by pulling our coats to Nick Thorkelson, whose piece on George Massa, who you mentioned before, is included in the show. And you felt very strongly that Nick had to be represented, was an important figure in the story of comics in Wisconsin. So tell us a little bit about Nick and his contributions.
Happy to do so. Born in Madison, left when he was 7 or 8 years old. Came back to Madison as a student, but also as a musician in a popular band not very far off campus, in a bar that doesn't exist anymore, Glen and Ann's. And also a casual artist. When this newspaper, the first underground newspaper in Wisconsin, came into existence, called Connections, very important role in the social movements at the time. He drew the very, very first underground comic series of panels or story. It's reprinted in the collection, in the catalog, and therefore he is really the first person in Wisconsin to draw this kind of comic ever. It appears in 1968 or 1969, but it's a statement that something new is coming to art. Comic art, but art in general in Wisconsin. And he goes on to be really an idealist and a social activist in dozens of different ways, and a community artist and an illustrator in various ways. But I'm happy to say that I dragged him after the turn of the new century into drawing for Wobblies and half a dozen other comics, and then a solo book on Herbert Marcuse, the idol of the 1960s and 1970s, New Left. And now we're engaged in something that I think will interest you, that is to say, a comic about the life and work of William Morris, the great English designer, in his time thought to be the greatest English poet of all, but we remember him for his many designs now. as they say, every middle-class home has William Morris wallpaper on the walls. I think that probably is true. So this is a further attempt to see the great idealist and utopian William Morris as an artist and explain through comics what that art means. Nick Torkelson has been involved with me now for 20 years doing comics, and I'm very satisfied with the great work he's done, but none is greater than a long piece for the reunion of Madison students from 1968, published in 2 years ago for the reunion, 50th reunion, and the work on George Mossey, which is ongoing and in larger form, because George Mossey, the great historian of the gay Holocaust, but also the great historian of European social intellectual history, represents a tremendous amount of, concentrates a tremendous amount of things that we've thought about and consider important about modern culture. And George Mossey was crazy about comics, even as a kid in Germany in the 1920s.
All right, Paul, I have one more question for you, and then we'll turn to some of the listeners' questions. Last time. Clearly, you're very well versed in the history of comics and graphic novels. So for those listeners out there who would like to learn more, read more, off the top of your head, what graphic novels or comics would you recommend to someone? And I have a list of these types of people. Someone who likes to read history. What are the great historical comics or graphic novels, would you say?
Well, gosh, it's a difficult question. The one which is making the most imprint now is called March. It's a story, a 3-volume story about the life of the now late John Lewis, the congressman and civil rights hero. That's made an enormous splash. People who want to understand where modern comics came from will likely already know about Maus, M-A-U-S, or Maus by Art Spiegelman, because it possibly made comics into an art form, or rather to be recognized as an art form. So that's very important. Persepolis by a European artist made an enormous impression. So did Fun Home. Those two being comic artists of feminist artists of great importance. But the one that no Wisconsinite should be without knowing something about would have to be Linda Berry, who meant a lot to readers in the alternative press in the 1980s and 1990s, and then began to emerge with books of her own that stunned people for the insights into her own very difficult youthful life, but also into a whole variety of things about modern life and psychology and so forth and so forth. She won a MacArthur Award a couple of years ago, a very high award. I must add, Mary Jo Buhle also won that award some 30 years ago. So she's the dean of current comic art in Wisconsin, and we're very lucky to have her. I think someone who would start with those, and you can always look at Amazon under Paul Buhl and comics, and you might even find this, one of my favorites that hardly anybody has bought, but I like it a lot. My childhood hero was Johnny Appleseed. I had a great aunt who swore she had a tree that came from one of Johnny Appleseed's pack of seeds. It doesn't seem likely, but many farm people would make that claim. Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, was a Swedenborgian who believed in peace and love rather than conquest, and was a militant, non-resistance activist and believer. And he always seemed to offer a different way forward for American life than the main route that's been pursued.
All right. So, Paul, let's turn to some of these comments. Any thoughts on comics in the future? Will the comic strip always be around in one form or another?
Well, newspapers have had it. The element for comics in daily newspapers, it's true that Bill Griffith still has Zippy in some papers, which is a bolt of light. And there are a few younger artists who have interesting things to say. But by and large, there's no money, there's no space, and therefore it's a very limited world. Now, Art Spiegelman says when an art form is dead, it naturally goes onto museum walls. That's a wonderful, ironic comment, but it cuts both ways because since the crashing of abstract art and the recognition that the human figure will always be at the center of recognizable art, comics have made a contribution and are destined to make a contribution. And the lines between formal art, museum art, high-priced art, and comic art of any kind have blurred. Ben Kachor, one of the most important artists of today, people should look for his work too, Katchor. He's taught comics for now 15 years at Parsons, and he says that using the computer and all the other things available, the forms that people thought of as comic art have been scattered. A great number of different kinds of experiments and these graphic possibilities have emerged as much online as on paper, of course. So the fate of comics is not entirely clear. It can't be, but they're an integral part of all levels of modern culture in the ways that no one could possibly have thought so 60 years ago, when until they were displaced by television, were considered the greatest corrupter of youth and parent to juvenile delinquency and otherwise something dangerous for children to have in the house, although we all had them.
Another question, what is the distinctive element of Wisconsin comics compared to elsewhere?
Here we got Rich Kaplan. I'm very glad to have that question, but it's by no means easy to answer. And one of the reasons is between these great artists who emerged in the 1920s and the underground artists who emerged toward the end of the 60s, there really isn't much. I mean, the biggest thing is in Racine, they're publishing comic books, including Donald Duck, literally printing comic books. But there's a blank space here because the creativity of the comic industry, and therefore the people who worked in comics, historically was always in greater New York, all the way to Connecticut. And if you wanted a job and to work in comics and be an artist in comics, then you had to leave the Midwest and go to New York. In the later 1960s, most uniquely, the Bay Area became the center of comics. So if you put all this stuff together, you would say that if not for Dennis Kitchen creating a small comic empire in Wisconsin, we might never have come to the point where something called Wisconsin comics was a genre or a phenomenon. You can ask what Dennis Kitchen managed to do in bringing together homebred Wisconsin artists with artists from around the world. And that question is best posed to the reader of the catalog when someone comes to the show. I'd say, come and look for yourself, see if you can find the discerning elements that tell you what Wisconsin comic art's like.
And please let me know while you're there.
That's right. Somebody knows the answer, but that person hasn't spoken up yet.
Rich has another question. Any connection between Harvey Kurtzman and 1930s radical culture?
Oh boy. Someone wrote a biography after Dennis and I did, a longer biography of Harvey Kurtzman, very nice guy, and it's good work. But he said to me, you know, that he, for his work, read more than a dozen interviews with Harvey Kurtzman over the decades. And I was the only one that ever asked about Harvey Kurtzman's family or their political beliefs. That would be typical of me as an interviewer. Well, Harvey Kurtzman grows up in a Jewish family in the Bronx, and his mother read the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, very popular in parts of the Bronx, the Jewish parts of the Bronx, to him over supper each night. Now, he didn't take to the Russian stuff. That didn't interest him at all. But he took to the idea that one should have a critical view of American culture and American economics and American life. When he got into the Army, he realized how horrible the racial climate was in the Army, especially but not only in the South. And this enraged him perhaps more than anything had in his life previously. He felt that something was very wrong in American society if it could be so racist that ordinary people of color didn't have a chance. If you look at Mad Comics, it's much more about advertising and culture and politics in a general sense. But there is a sensibility that Harvey Kurtzman passed on to the artists of the 70s. And here's something I wish to say about the catalog. It isn't as if these Wisconsin and other artists around Dennis Kitchen had some terribly clear political thing to say, but they were offended by the climate of war and national chauvinism and restrictive attitudes towards what young people thought and did. They were pretty grouchy about the laws against the use of marijuana in particular, but they were looking toward a freer, more open society of some kind, a more peaceful society of some kind. And you can say that is their politics. And if we look for something that is the connecting element in this exhibit, that certainly is it.
Michael Dooley pointed out that Bill Shelley is the biographer of the second Kurtzman biography, which you mentioned.
Very good work.
Well, tell us a little bit more. You mentioned you met Dennis Kitchen in 1969.
Dennis Kitchen sent me a couple of prime issues of Mad Comics that I'd never possessed from 1951. Now, I was never really an organized person sufficiently to be a comic collector. So I had seen the contents of this reprinted, but I had never actually seen these particular issues in life. They were wrapped in plastic, as everything Dennis Kitchen has from comics are. I had to treat them very gently. I couldn't let my parakeet climbing around my shoulders chew on the pages or spill any coffee on them or use a random part of the cover to roll a joint. I had to be sure to give them back to Dennis. And he arrived in Madison a couple of weeks later to take them back in person, just in case I might have misused those things. Well, inasmuch as Dennis Kitchen was running for lieutenant governor of Wisconsin on the Socialist Labor Party ticket, a very non-communist, anti-communist, old-fashioned socialist party believing in government from below, inasmuch as he was a real deeply American socialist type, and I was equally a deeply American socialist type, we hit it off right there. And we talked about a sequel to Radical America Comics in the Kitchen Comics empire, but somehow or other that didn't happen. But we stayed in touch, and I began to realize in the 80s that Dennis Kitchen reprinting older comic classics from the 1930s and 1940s was taking an invaluable role in introducing people to the history of comic art. He also encouraged people like Will Eisner to go get their pens out again and start drawing more. But the most important thing was that these were more than ancient reprints. These bits of comic art were important not only for artists of the 1980s and thereafter, but for readers to understand that comic art came from someplace. It had a specific trajectory, not only here, but around the world. And there weren't very many people doing that in the 1980s. Dennis was very, very keen about it. So he plays a remarkable, I would say still little understood role in comics through his work, not even mentioning gay comics, which appear in the middle 1970s, dope comics about the same time, and a lot of very funny stuff and remarkable stuff in the, I would describe it as peace and love category. And we certainly need more peace and love today.
Certainly do. We have another question from Henry Chamberlain. There's something to be said for anyone being able to draw comics, but don't you think there's a basic set of standards? Being a cartoonist is a specific talent or skill, correct?
Well, I have the impression, looking back on my childhood, that in fifth grade, I met a fellow student, and we went to his place, and he started to draw. And I realized that day I was never going to be a comic artist. It was a revelation for an 11-year-old. So it's a belief of a number of artists, like Ben Catchor. I brought him and Harvey Pekar together on a stage in Toronto probably 15 years ago. And Ben gave Harvey kind of a hard time about it, saying if you have a desire to write about comics, then you certainly write comics, then you certainly should try to draw comics. And Harvey just said, no, that isn't what I do. I'd be spending too much time trying to draw when I leave that to artists. And that also is my view. It may be, as Linda Berry says, that when you're 9 years old or 10 years old and somebody says you can't draw good, that you think immediately, I can't do it, and you never try it again. That might have happened to me when I was 9 or 10. I don't know. But I would say more like people have an inclination and they pursue that inclination and they think about that inclination. And if they work on it long enough, they can make themselves into serious comic artists. And that's true for people 9 and 10 years old today as it was in my early youth. So I don't want to encourage anyone to think that it's easy to become a comic artist, and I don't want to discourage anyone to suggest that it's impossible to become a comic artist. It's an inclination and work that you would need to devote a serious chunk of your life to. And if you're willing to do that and to expect very, very little in return for a very long time, then it's something to pursue.
Certainly. And I think if you look at the exhibition itself or the exhibition catalog, you see there are a broad range of styles, certain draftsmen whose drawing skills are that match the standards of classical Western art. And there are other works that are rough-hewn, homespun, simplistic, still sophisticated and subtle in their simplicity, but certainly something that people without a background in fine art, say, could achieve. So hopefully that's the lessons.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because another thing that Dennis Kitchen really did, more so than the underground comic scene in the Bay Area, and more so than the more professional comic scene, which is emerging in New York, was to encourage this vast array of different comic styles and to make it available to people, but as important, to make those pages available to those artists and to explain to a readership that comic art, as you say, Tyler, is not one thing. It's however it is defined by the artist and understood and appreciated by the audience. A big thing in the history of comic art.
Certainly, I think that's another one of the innovations of the underground movement, as I understand it, this DIY attitudes toward publication and distribution, something that you also find in the world of zines and mini comics.
That's right. That's very much so. The leading place to buy Radical America comics in Madison was the Electric Eye, which mostly had psychedelic posters, a few bongs, handmade jewelry from people around town, and other kinds of things. It was a milieu that wasn't much like the university bookstore. And during the 1970s, these sort of hippie stores offered an array of things, including comics, that were very different from anything we'd expected walking into a store in our childhood. And those stores all went away, but something new had been introduced into popular culture. And even if it rarely got to the newsstands, such as the newsstands were, even if it remained DIY and traded among various artists, you give me mine, I'll give you yours, it was an expression of potential mass creativity. The Xerox machine was a great aid to that for the zines. And then finally, much later, the web and sending stuff out to anyone who wants to see it. So these are all, in a darkening world where we're in so much trouble in so many different ways. The possibility of mass creativity is one of the things that we have in favor of humanity's survival.
Sounds right to me. Paul, what projects do you have in the pipeline? What can we expect from you next?
Well, I mentioned a comic with Nick Torkelson on William Morris. I was hoping today what would arrive in the mail, but didn't, the very first copy of a comic that I've edited on the life of Paul Robeson, the once famous African-American singer who really introduced the Black spiritual into the American songbook as something important and not just sentimental and trivial, but some key part of American culture. And I've just begun to work with another artist on the souls of Black folk, W.B. Du Bois' famed 1903 book, which was quoted in the Civil Rights March of 1963 as a key document in the history of African American life. So these are a few of the projects that are underway, and I'm hoping to continue as long as I can to tell these stories about mostly American life that have not been sufficiently told or have never been told in a popular way for an audience under the age of 30 for the most part.
All right, Paul, I think we have time for one more question. Takes us back 50 years or so. Back in 1971, Buhl posed the project of underground comics as part of a countercultural hegemonic project. Thoughts about that?
I see now, a magazine in Slovakia has reprinted an essay from 1971 or 1970, most startling, on my predictions about underground comics. So, well, we really thought that the counterculture could change society, and it turned out not to be true. But underground comics were, along with the music of the time and a certain projection of philosophical inquiry and more what we used to call free love and so forth, as a countercultural hegemonic project. I mean, we wanted the hegemony to be moved from a warrior generation to a peace generation, among other things. And it didn't really happen, but we made a dent and made a statement about how society could be different. Did my work in comics or anybody's work in underground comics make a difference? I like to think we did.
Wonderful. Paul, thank you so much for your time tonight, for the remarks and your essay in the catalog. I hope that anyone who hasn't had a chance to make it to MOWA West Bend or MOWA Downtown and St. Kate the Arts Hotel will have the chance before November 22nd to see the exhibition. If so, or even if not, I would suggest that you try to procure a copy of the catalog. You can do so by, at this point, calling the museum, and the shop can send it to you. Hopefully, we'll have a mechanism for ordering it online in the not too distant future.
It's a great catalog. It's really a great catalog. I urge people to read it. You'll learn an enormous amount from reading it.
Indeed, indeed. So thanks once again. Thank you again to the Wisconsin Humanities Council for supporting this talk, and I hope to see you all at the exhibition.
Thanks so much. And
Bye.
So